I'm Nathalie Molina Niño, and I am really happy to be here. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm also a recovering global tech startup junkie. I spent the first 15 years of my career deep in the trenches of the globalization industry, with offices in 37 countries and teams in over 40. I know enough to be dangerous about managing a 1,600-person operation and working around the clock in Mumbai, or about the exorbitantly high cost of social benefits in Brazil. Basically, I learned just enough to get by in a lot of places and spent a decade and a half being everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But for the first time in my 22 years in business, I started when I was 12. I recently started a business, Brava, that is entirely focused on one jurisdiction for now, and that's the US. And let me tell you, taking a deep dive into one place has been eye-opening, and doing it right now in the United States especially. And while the stories I'm about to tell you are very US-centric, I would venture a guess, especially after getting to know some of my colleagues and some of my panelists who will be discussing this topic with me in a breakout tomorrow, that my learnings might also ring true for many of the countries represented in this room. You'll find a lot of my research in my new book. I recently wrote a book called LEAPFROG, The New Revolution for Women Entrepreneurs, which was published by Random House about 2 months ago. It's in the library. Please, folks in the US who can get it easily, let our international folks have it first. I wrote it because as I got to know the landscape in the US over the last few years, I was seeing what I call the valley of death for women entrepreneurs. You see, in the US, women are starting more businesses than men. And it's a stat that a lot of people know. But what most people don't know is that 8 out of 10 of those are started by a woman of color. And as many in the room may know, despite all of the lip service that we pay, especially in the US, the reality is that at least in venture capital dollars, depending on what study you look at, we've been going from 5% the year before last to 2.5% going to women-owned businesses. What's worse? 2% of that VC money goes to women of color, which is to say that the single most entrepreneurial group there is getting the least amount of capital. Like any complex problem, there are a lot of solutions to put forward here, but I would argue that simply throwing more women at the problem isn't the solution. I call that the add women and stir model, right? Whereby we throw women at something and assume that things will magically fix themselves. We've seen more women entering the investing space, and more importantly, as Suzanne and Wharton's project SAGE illustrated, we've seen more people enter the space of gender lens investing specifically. And just as Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, didn't apply to women of color, who, by the way, have been leaning in for a long time in the modern workforce and not getting results, simply having more women or men enter the gender lens investing space hasn't moved the dial for women of color either. Because it turns out women in the US have been doing what we criticize Silicon Valley of doing. They've been doing pattern matching. And that's why in the US, we have an industry of white women investing only in other white women for the most part. Pattern matching. So the key here is not just putting more money into women investors or investors of any gender who focus on women. The key is to invest in diverse women and men of color, which means emerging managers that are truly emerging. The ones that look nothing like the people currently holding most partner-level positions at most investment funds. Which is essentially what I discovered next. So after writing the book, I spent the last 2 years finding out that it turns out there's a valley of death for emerging managers as well. And the programs, some regional, but in some cases with global footprints, the programs that were designed to address this issue within the large institutional capital sources are just not doing it. Emerging manager programs all say that they're intended to support emerging managers, who incidentally, data shows, tend to perform better than their colleagues. And their aim, they say, is to create pathways for new, especially underrepresented fund managers to enter the space. It sounds wonderful, right? What could be better? Better performance, more diversity, amazing. But more often than not, these programs have structural issues that all but guarantee racial and gender disparities. They tend to have requirements that seem benign and not gender or race oriented at all, and yet Like too many structural issues, they specifically exclude mostly women of color and men of color. In what has amounted to over 2 years of my own research, I've found the following to be my top 3 favorite prerequisites of emerging manager programs. Number 1, a team with a track record as a group, not as individuals, but as a group of having made investment decisions. Track records acquired independently, meaning that this team is coming together for the first time, and not as a team, typically aren't good enough. Number 2, a previous fund, meaning emerging manager means second fund or later. And my favorite of all, a minimum of $100 to $300 million on your balance sheet before we can start a meaningful conversation with you as an emerging manager. At first, I remember looking at the term emerging manager and thinking, I don't think this means what you think it means, because if you meet these requirements, can you really be considered emerging? But then I realized who does benefit from these requirements. And recently, I met an investor who was among the first LPs in one emerging manager's first fund. His name is Tag, and he set out to raise a $300 million first-time fund. And in order to mitigate risk, he leaned on his father's connections to secure him about $200 million in allocations from the old boys club in Silicon Valley that very few now have access to. So raising $200 million to go into other people's famous and now infamously inaccessible funds was, as you can imagine, not hard. Raising the final $100 million on the back of those first 2 as an emerging manager was also not problematic. For those of you who haven't figured out who Tag is, I'm referring to Tag Romney and his father, Mitt Romney, the 2012 US Republican presidential nominee and former CEO at Bain. Whether the descriptions say this or not, that is who these emerging manager programs are structured to serve best today. But the days of this kind of disconnect between optics and actual outcomes are, in my opinion, numbered. And I don't mean just in the US, I mean everywhere that conscious consumers and savvy impact investors are surfacing. So for those of you that are familiar with Nexus, it's a conference that gathers the next generation of wealth holders in a global summit each summer at the UN. And it's the fastest growing group for them are their membership in Africa, in the Middle East, in China, in India, and they recently held their first summit in Latin America in my home country of Ecuador. Whether it's emboldened employees with retirement plans or foundations with next generation board members and donors, managers of large sources of capital are starting to get questions about the diversity of their fund manager cohorts. Here's an example that might seem very provincial, but when you consider that California's GDP, if it were a country, would be the 5th largest in the world, it helps put things into a larger perspective. Last year, the Honorable Nora Vargas was appointed by California's Governor Jerry Brown to serve as the first Latina to join the CalSTRS board, where she helps manage over $250 billion in retirement funds for nearly 1 million California educators. Nearly 1 in 5 of those educators are Latinas. And according to the Department of Labor, Latinas make up the fastest growing group to be entering the teaching profession in the US. And while it's embarrassing that it didn't occur to anyone to have a Latina help manage their own retirement fund until 2017, you better believe that Nora is going to make sure that other Latinas will join her in making sure CalSTRS puts money into Latina fund managers. But more importantly, Nora is part of a wave of professional women of color who are getting into US politics. She holds an elected position representing the community college that she attended in San Diego. And she plans to make sure that teachers in California are asking the question of how many women are being included in the big business of investing their money. Women as consumers and investors and stakeholders in their own collective assets are getting informed and they're speaking up. This isn't something that's unique to California, and it certainly isn't something that's unique to the US. What's more, true emerging managers, those not related to an almost president or in possession of a lengthy track record, from day one, this is where the real returns will be found. The historical data supports this, and if you'd like to see it, I invite you to approach my fabulous friend, Darren Dodson, from the Lumen Capital, who will be speaking next and can give you mountains of that data. But suffice it to say that it isn't a new trend. With the exception of ethnicity, gender, and other assets that give us a unique edge, funds by women and underrepresented groups don't look that different from the early days of the iconic funds that are now our massive industry leaders. Many of which, by the way, also started without $100 million on their balance sheet and without lengthy track records. And most important, today's emerging funds stand to be just as successful. And just like 30, 15 years ago, today's funds need on-ramps. They need incubation. Emerging manager programs didn't do what they set out to do. So what we need now is funds of funds that focus on deploying capital where our communities and our economy most need it, which is to say, in the place most likely to yield great returns, the most undervalued, underappreciated asset of all, women. We need funds like Darren's Illumin Capital or Shelley Porges's and Leslie Jump's Different platform. They don't need anything different than the emerging managers in the past needed when they were first starting. And just like them, we need to get beyond the high net worth individuals and the family offices. Here's the bottom line. In order to see real progress and real economic gains, we need to see engagement from the large institutions, or this recent uptick of women and men of color starting funds is going to be nothing but a blip. We run the risk of having them all get stuck in this black, brown, and female ghetto of small funds that never get to $1 billion because most of them are struggling just to get 100. That's not how we build a future that's female, and it's what needs to happen, not from a perspective of what's coming in the future, because this is the work of our generation today. It's our legacy. Thank you.